Hi, my name's Robert Franz, and this is Ask Robert. Question number 5. This question is actually a two-parter. So first is, are there any instruments that are not represented in Baroque music? And the second part of this, I kind of mashed two questions together, is for someone untrained in music but appreciates and enjoys listening, is there any particular way for the untrained ear to say, that sounds like Baroque to me, what should I listen for? I lumped them together because they both really have instrumental components. So first off, what instruments are not represented in Baroque music? Saxophones. Why, you might ask? It has nothing to do personally with any saxophone players. I love my saxophone player friends, but the saxophone was not invented till about the 1840s or so. It was right around the middle 1840s when Adolphe Sax invented the saxophone. And the Baroque period lasted from approximately 1600 to 1750. So Baroque period ended about 100 years shy of Adolphe Sax's great invention. But there are other instruments you don't typically see in a Baroque orchestra. Clarinets. Now, while clarinets were invented around 1700, they didn't come into standard usage until about 1750s or so, and maybe even a little bit later. In fact, Mozart's first usage of them, Mozart was a big proponent of the clarinet. He loved the sound of the instrument. But the instrument needed to become more advanced first before people could really love it. And so he wrote his first piece using clarinets in 1771. There is actually a quote in one of Benjamin Franklin's letters that in 1756 he heard a clarinet at a Moravian church in Bethlehem, Pennsylvania. So they were around in the mid-18th century, but they didn't become finessed enough to be included in the orchestra towards the end of the 18th century, which is why most music of Baroque composers and early classical composers do not use clarinets. Trombones were used in Baroque music, but very special ways. Usually they were used either to play along with the vocal lines in a choral work in a church, in a sacred setting, or they were used in a pit for an opera. But they were rarely used in orchestra up on stage performing. That really didn't start happening until the end of the 18th century. And then tuba, you might be asking, what about that? Well, there were some predecessors to the tuba that were around, but they weren't part of the orchestra. And the tuba wasn't actually an instrument that was seen typically until early to mid 19th century, so they also missed it. Finally, we have the piano. Normally you don't hear a piano in Baroque music and in early classical music. And that's because the piano, which was also invented around 1700, really took a while to sort of work the issues out with the instrument. And so while composers were intrigued by it, composers like Bach felt like the forte piano, especially the first ones he tried, were really not good enough to write music for it, so he just stayed clear of them until way later in life. And then of course when we get to the time of Mozart and Haydn, and then of course Beethoven for sure, the piano has come into its own by the end of the 18th century. But this brings me to my second part of this question, which was, if for the untrained ear that you appreciate music and you enjoy listening, how do you tell if the music is Baroque? And one of the easiest ways to figure out if music is Baroque is by the use of a harpsichord. Now, a harpsichord is the predecessor of the piano, and when you look at the keyboard, it looks quite similar, except that often there are multiple keyboards rather than just one. The big difference between a harpsichord and a piano is that a harpsichord has a plectra, and basically when you hit the key, it plucks the string, and that's how the sound is made. Whereas the piano has a hammer, and when you hit the key, when you strike the key, the hammer hits the string and makes the sound. Because of this, the piano could sustain the sounds a lot more. The harpsichord was more of a quick dying sound. But the idea of the harpsichord was to be able to fill in the chords in between the other instrumentalists. And also, you can hear it. Generally, you don't hear the pitch so much, the notes that they're playing, but you can hear the timbre or the color of the instrument. And it sounds almost like these crisp, cringling little sounds that are throughout the music. If you hear those, you are 98% sure that you're listening to Baroque music. Also, there are a couple of other telltale signs. One, Baroque music, a lot of it, not all of it, but a lot of it, was very string-centric. And secondly, you might very well hear recorders. Recorders, we all have played in elementary school. It's an instrument that we all learn on. But recorder really had their heyday in the 17th and early 18th century in Baroque music. And so if you hear recorders and harpsichord and lots of strings, you're probably listening to some Baroque music.